Have you ever wished you could listen to a podcast on any topic? At any time? Well, Google just released a powerful new AI tool called Notebook LM that lets you do just that. Let's use this new tool to make a short podcast about today's top trending news stories. First, let's check out a couple big news sites to see what's trending. Now let's try finding some articles on those topics that we can input to Notebook LM. Copy the link to your article, then head back to Notebook LM and click down at the bottom where it says website to paste it in. Sometimes the link you provide is not accepted, giving an error message instead. I found AP News and PBS News to have high rates of acceptance. Now let's generate the audio. I'm curious to see how it turned out. Let's listen to episode 1 of the OnlyFacts podcast.
All right, ready to dive in. Today we're looking at some pretty big stories happening right now.
Yeah, definitely a lot going on.
We've got the ceasefire deal in the Gaza Strip, the whole thing with TikTok potentially getting banned here in the U.S.
Oh, and we can't forget about Trump's cabinet confirmations. That's going to be interesting.
Right. We've got articles from PBS News and AP News, so we're getting different sides of the story. It should be pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think there are going to be some surprises in there for sure.
Definitely. Okay, so let's start with the Gaza Strip. Big news. A ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas.
Trying to bring a pause to this war that's been going on for over a year.
What's different about this deal compared to the other times they tried to stop the fighting?
Well, this one's not just about stopping the violence. They're talking about releasing hostages, a gradual withdrawal of Israeli forces.
And the Palestinians who had to leave can go back.
Right. And there's a promise of humanitarian aid, too.
That's a big one.
It is. But, they've made similar agreements before, and they haven't always worked. So we'll see.
Is this time going to be any different? Right. It's interesting, though. Biden and Trump are both saying they made this deal happen.
Yeah.
Is that just politics, or is there more to it?
I mean, they both want to look good. Right.
Of course.
Especially with a new administration about to take over.
Yeah.
Global peace equals good PR.
Makes sense. But this ceasefire, it doesn't seem like everyone's on board. Netanyahu's getting some pushback from his own people.
Oh, yeah. Some of his coalition partners are pretty upset. The ones with the hardline stances.
Right.
Some are even saying they'll leave the government if this deal goes through.
Really?
Yeah, they think any compromise with Hamas is bad, even if it means stopping the fighting for now.
Wow. These articles really show you what it's been like in Gaza during this whole thing.
Yeah.
There's this one image, kids playing in the ruins of Khan Yunis. It's just
heavy.
Yeah. And the families with hostages not knowing what to expect.
It's a powerful reminder, all these headlines, it's real people's lives that have been torn apart.
It's heartbreaking.
This truce, it's a little bit of hope, but the damage is going to take a long time to heal.
Definitely. Even if the ceasefire holds, there's so much distrust between the two sides.
Yeah.
The Palestinians in Gaza, they're hopeful, but they want to see action and fast.
Right. They're urging for quick implementation.
And the Israeli families, they're just desperate for their loved ones to come home.
You can feel it.
Can they really trust each other after everything that's happened?
Rebuilding trust takes time. Words aren't enough. They need to see action, see those terms actually being carried out. That's the only way the ceasefire has a chance.
I also noticed the numbers of casualties are different depending on who you ask, Israel or Palestine.
Yeah, that's typical in these situations.
Is it intentional?
Hard to say. Getting accurate information in a war zone is tough.
Right.
It's hard to get access, and both sides might be twisting things to fit their narrative.
So what you're saying is,
get your news from multiple sources and think critically about what you're reading.
Don't just take everything at face value. Makes sense. So this deal, it's just a start, right? What could cause it to fall apart?
Well, the hostage exchange is going to be tricky. Lots of logistics to figure out. And if that breaks down,
tensions could flare up again.
Easily. Plus, the bigger issues about Gaza's future, they're still there.
Still unresolved.
If those aren't addressed, the violence will probably start up again. It's almost inevitable.
All right, so we've got this fragile peace in Gaza, but now let's switch gears completely. Let's talk about TikTok and the whole ban situation here in the U.S.
Yeah, the U.S. government and TikTok are headed for a showdown, and the Supreme Court's about to make a decision that could change everything.
Okay, so the U.S. government says TikTok is a national security threat. What are they worried about specifically?
It all comes down to ByteDance, the company that owns TikTok.
The Chinese company.
Right. The U.S. government thinks that all the user data TikTok collects could end up in the hands of the Chinese government.
And that could be used against us.
That's the worry.
Trump was really loud about banning TikTok when he was in office before, but Biden's not letting up on it either.
No, he's not. The Biden administration chose not to enforce a law that would make ByteDance sell TikTok.
Okay.
But they made it clear they're not happy about the data security issues either. Now it's up to the new Trump administration to decide what to do with that law.
So TikTok's stuck in the middle of this whole geopolitical battle. But even if there are security concerns, banning an entire social media platform seems extreme.
It does, doesn't it?
What about free speech?
That's exactly what TikTok and its supporters are saying.
They're saying it's unconstitutional.
Pretty much. They argue that a ban would set a dangerous precedent and violate the First Amendment rights of millions of Americans.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court's going to have to decide whether the government's security concerns are strong enough to outweigh those free speech concerns. It's a tough one.
We actually spoke to Carrie Cordero about this. She's a legal and national security expert.
Okay, what did she have to say?
Well, she thinks the Supreme Court's probably going to uphold the law forcing ByteDance to sell TikTok.
So TikTok could disappear from the U.S.
Potentially. If no one wants to buy it, it might become much harder to access here.
Wow.
That would be a huge deal for the, 170 million Americans who use TikTok?
Yeah, huge.
But Cordero also said this law is short-sighted. What did she mean by that?
She thinks it's too focused on TikTok specifically.
And not the bigger picture.
Right. There are other foreign-owned apps that could pose the same risks.
Oh, like that Red Note app I keep hearing about.
Exactly. She said it's like playing whack-a-mole. Ban one app and another one pops up.
So even if TikTok goes away, the data security issues might not.
Exactly. Red Note's already gaining popularity, and it's got the same issues with data privacy and potential Chinese government influence.
It's tricky.
This whole situation shows how hard it is to balance national security and free speech in the digital age, and we definitely need to be paying attention to it.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got the ceasefire, we've got TikTok, and now let's shift to something else, something happening here at home. Trump's cabinet confirmations.
Always interesting. The confirmation hearings always give you a glimpse into what the new administration is thinking.
What they're going to focus on.
Yeah, you get a preview of their stance on taxes, tariffs, the environment, all that.
Let's start with Scott Bessent, Trump's pick for Treasury Secretary. His background is kind of all over the place. Former Soros executive, hedge fund founder, and he gave a ton of money to Trump's campaign.
Yeah, interesting mix. It'll be interesting to see how all that influences his decisions at the Treasury.
During his confirmation hearing, he was all for extending Trump's tax cuts, said letting them expire would wreck the economy.
Big statement.
And he defended Trump's tariffs, too, especially the ones on China.
Interesting.
Hold on, if those tax cuts get extended, won't that affect our listeners directly?
Definitely. A lot of people could see changes in their tax bill, so yeah, it's something to keep an eye on.
For sure. And what about his take on tariffs? Democrats aren't too happy about those, right?
No, they're not. They think tariffs end up hurting American consumers and workers because prices go up, and they're worried about starting a trade war with China. It'll be interesting to see how Bessent handles all of that.
So Bessent's on deck for Treasury. Who else is Trump bringing in?
Well, for the EPA, he's picked Lee Zeldin, a former congressman from New York. Big Trump supporter.
Wait, isn't this the same EPA that Trump talked about getting rid of?
The one and only. Which makes Zeldin's nomination pretty interesting.
It does.
You know, his views on the environment have changed quite a bit. Back in 2016, he was all about moving away from fossil fuels, going green. But now, he seems to be all about producing energy, even if it means relying on fossil fuels. Politics can really shift your priorities, it seems.
What did he say about potentially dismantling the EPA?
He was pretty vague. Said he wasn't really familiar with the concept. Not exactly reassuring.
Not really, no. So we've got a Treasury Secretary who might extend tax cuts and an EPA nominee who's a bit of a question mark. Anyone else?
For Interior Secretary, Trump's nominated Doug Burgum, the governor of North Dakota. He's also been a presidential candidate, and he's an energy expert. He'll play a big role in shaping the new administration's energy policy.
And his confirmation hearing happened just a day after Trump went on Truth Social and said he doesn't want any windmills built during his presidency. Did Burgum say anything about that?
Oh, yeah. He's on board with prioritizing fossil fuels over renewables, like wind energy, right in line with Trump's statement.
One thing that struck me about all these confirmation hearings, no one really asked about conflicts of interest.
Yeah, that's a good point. You'd think that would be a big focus.
Right. Makes you wonder how closely these nominations are being examined.
It's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Let's talk about those day one promises that Trump made during his campaign. Remember those. Mass deportations, closing the border, ending birthright citizenship, pardoning the January 6th rioters, prioritizing fossil fuels, all of that. Can he actually do all of that on day one?
A lot of those promises are, well, ambitious to say the least. Some would require Congress to pass new laws or even changes to the Constitution.
Which takes time.
A lot of time. And we're already seeing Trump backpedal on some things. He's admitted that completely closing the border isn't realistic, and he's hinted that ending birthright citizenship might need a different legal strategy.
So there's a difference between campaigning and actually governing.
A big difference.
Yeah.
Even with executive orders, there are limits to what a president can do on their own.
It'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. Which promises does he actually try to keep? Which ones does he change? And which ones does he just give up on?
It all depends on his priorities. Which promises matter most to him? Which ones does he think he can actually achieve? And which ones is he willing to sacrifice to get things done? It's all a game of strategy and power, and the stakes are high. This whole TikTok situation is really something, isn't it? Makes you think.
It does, about national security, about free speech, about the power of tech companies.
And the power of the government to regulate them. It's a tough balance.
You're right. And going back to those day one promises, it makes you wonder what Trump really intends to do. Were those promises ever meant to be kept, or were they just for show?
It's hard to say for sure, but it does make you think about the role of rhetoric in politics. How much of what we hear during a campaign is real, and how much is just for the cameras?
It's up to us to figure that out, to be informed voters. Okay, so we've got this fragile ceasefire in Gaza, a potential TikTok ban with global implications, and the beginnings of the new Trump administration. Is there a connection between all these things?
I think there is, yeah. They all highlight the tension between different interests. National security versus individual rights, economic growth versus environmental protection, campaign promises versus the reality of governing.
And at the core of all of it is power. Who has it, who uses it, who benefits from it.
Exactly.
We've been talking about these big global and political events, but let's bring it back down to earth for a minute. What does all this mean for our listeners? How could these events affect their lives?
Well, if TikTok gets banned, that directly impacts how millions of Americans use social media. What happens with the ceasefire in Gaza could affect global politics and international relations. And the policies that the new Trump administration puts in place could affect everything. Taxes, healthcare, the environment, education.
It's all connected.
It is. And it's not just about these specific events. It's about the bigger trends they represent. The rise of social media and how it shapes our lives, the challenges of balancing security and freedom, the growing divide between different political views. These are all things we need to think about as individuals and as a society.
You're right. And going back to those day one promises, some of them could have a huge impact on people's lives. Mass deportations, changes to immigration, even challenging birthright citizenship. Those are big issues that really resonate with Trump's supporters, but they could also create a lot of fear and uncertainty for others.
Absolutely. Those promises tap into deep-seated anxieties and beliefs about who belongs in this country and who doesn't. And they raise some serious legal questions like, can a president just end birthright citizenship, which is a right guaranteed by the 14th Amendment? Legal experts disagree on that.
And what about pardoning the January 6th rioters? Democrats and even some Republicans are strongly opposed to that. What kind of message would that send if Trump goes ahead with it?
It would definitely be controversial. Some would see it as condoning the violence that happened that day, as undermining the rule of law. Others might see it as a gesture of mercy, a way to try to heal the divisions in the country. It's a decision with big consequences, that's for sure.
It feels like we're entering a time of huge uncertainty and change, both here in the U.S. and around the world.
Uncertainty is a part of life, isn't it? We're always navigating the unknown, trying to make sense of a world that's constantly changing. The key is to stay informed, to have thoughtful discussions, and to be willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases.
So we've got a ceasefire in Gaza that could fall apart at any moment, a potential TikTok ban that raises questions about national security and free speech, and a new administration with big promises and a lot of pressure to deliver. It's a lot to take in.
It is, and it's just a glimpse of what's happening in the world right now. But even with all the complexity and uncertainty, there's always hope for progress. It's up to us to stay engaged, to hold our leaders accountable, and to work towards a more just and equitable world.
You know, we've been talking about these big events, but it's important to bring it back to a personal level. What does this mean for our listeners? How might these events affect their everyday lives?
Well, like we said, the TikTok ban could directly affect how millions of people use social media. The outcome of the ceasefire in Gaza could have ripple effects on global politics and international relations. And the new Trump administration's policies could impact everything from taxes and healthcare to the environment and education. It's all connected, and it all matters to our lives in some way.
You're right. It really is all connected. It can feel overwhelming, all these big challenges, but you're right. It all starts with us, with the small things we do every day.
Yeah, I think that's what makes these deep dives so important.
They give us the information, the knowledge we need to make sense of it all.
To make informed choices about how we want to participate.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, any final thoughts, any questions you'd like to leave our listeners with? Something to ponder, maybe spark some further exploration?
I think the biggest takeaway today is critical thinking.
It is crucial.
We're flooded with information constantly from every direction.
It's hard to sift through it all.
Exactly. To know what's true, what's biased, what's just trying to play with our emotions. We can't just accept everything we see or hear.
We have to be skeptical, question everything.
Absolutely. And seek out different viewpoints.
Not just take things at face value.
Critical thinking isn't just about analyzing information, though.
It's about looking at ourselves, too.
It is. It's about questioning our own beliefs, our own assumptions. Where do our biases come from? How do they affect how we see the world?
That's deep.
It's uncomfortable sometimes, but it's essential for personal growth.
Yeah.
And for building a society where we understand each other better, a more compassionate society.
Well said. So, to our listener, as you go about your day, remember those critical thinking skills. Question everything, challenge those assumptions, keep learning.
The world's a complex place, but it's also a fascinating place.
And there's always something new to learn.
Exactly. You're not alone in this.
There are others out there.
So many people all over the world searching for truth, for understanding, trying to connect.
It's reassuring in a way.
Yeah, it is. So keep asking those questions. Share what you've learned. And never stop trying to make the world a better place. Your voice matters.
Your actions matter.
And your perspective is valuable.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure diving in with you.
We hope this has given you something to think about, something to explore further.
Until next time, stay curious.